Good evening. My name is Tim Neff, and I'm a Director of Museum and Education at Soldiers and Sailors Memorial Hall and Museum. I want to thank you all for joining us this evening for our weekly, or monthly, I should say, Spotlight On program. I must apologize. I'm a little scramble brain right now. We had a little problem with our initial link, so we're trying to get reconnected right now. I am not joined by my guests at this time, but I wanted to start the program and just say hello to everybody and thank you all for joining us. And I'm hoping that our guests will be able to reuse this new link to join us here shortly. But in the meantime, if this is the first time you're tuning in, this is our monthly Spotlight On program that takes place the second Thursday of each month. And we highlight different topics related to our mission at Soldiers and Sailors. Of course, Soldiers and Sailors is located in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. It is a memorial that was built back in 1910 as a Civil War memorial. There it is right there. And it was built here in Oakland, and basically on the campus of the University of Pittsburgh. And it is surrounded by the university, but it's a beacon in the middle of the university dedicated to honoring veterans, all those that have served our country. It was built as a Civil War memorial, but today it stands as a memorial and a museum that honors all veterans that have served from the Civil War through present day. The museum's exhibits are filled with artifacts that have been donated us through the years. And it's a wonderful place to visit. If you haven't been here in a while, I encourage you to come visit sometime, or if you've never been here, come check out our exhibits. Everything we have has been donated to us by veterans and their families, and we use these objects to honor them and tell their stories. So please come visit us if you haven't been here in a while. Tonight's program, we hopefully, if we have our guest in order here, we'll have time for questions and answers at the end. Questions can be submitted on Facebook via comment or YouTube via email, soldiersandsailorspittsburgh@gmail.com. You can join us that way and ask our questions as we go along here. And tonight I was to be planning by joined by Andrew Capitz, and we're going to address a topic that was very new to me. I did not know much about this. I've kind of talked about the concept before, but he really brought to light a lot of new details that I was not familiar with, and that is specifically the Bring Home the Soldier Dead League, which was a movement that was begun in World War I with the efforts to bring our soldiers' remains home to be buried with their families, so their families could visit the grave. It is a new concept that I learned a lot about from Andrew Capitz, and we're hoping that he'll be able to join us here shortly. Unfortunately, I'm afraid he's sitting on his end with a phone on airplane mode so that he doesn't worry about it ringing while the program is going on. But unfortunately, it's not working out right now. So with that, I think I'll jump down and I will tell a little bit about the stories that I had planned here. Now, this is going to skip over his presentation and come down here to some of the things that I was going to talk about related to our collection here at Soldiers and Sailors, and that includes something called the Easy Hull Tombstone. Now, if you're new to us, this is an amazing story. It dates back to the Civil War. I think I have told this on a prior episode before, but it relates so much to our topic today of bringing loved ones home and getting remains back home where they can be, visited and taken care of by loved ones. And this story, as I said, dates back to the Civil War. Easy Hall was a soldier from Michigan. He was in Company D of the 20th Michigan Infantry. He was wounded at Petersburg on June 18th, 1864, and he died 4 days later from his wounds. From there, his family is notified. So his family does know that he has been killed. And the idea is they want to have that body returned. So they pay at the time, and this is a service that was available at the time of the Civil War. They pay to have the body embalmed and brought home via train. However, things don't go really well. The train ride's long. It is not working very well. And unfortunately, the embalming process, we think, did not go very well. So by the time this train is passing through Pittsburgh, it is starting to smell pretty bad. There's a terrible odor. Passengers are getting sick, and the train has to stop. And the train is going to stop and unload Easy Hall's remains to be buried right here in Pittsburgh. So the idea is to bring him to Allegheny Cemetery and have a proper burial. However, along the way, a mistake is made, and his name is mixed up. So he was buried in a cemetery plot with the gravestone of Easy Hale, Hail, which is what we're seeing in that photo on the left there, is the tombstone for Easy Hale. Well, this causes all kinds of confusion. The family is completely lost. They know their loved one is dead, but they don't know where he's buried because of this simple mistake that happened here in Pittsburgh. It is not till 130 years later, so this goes generation to generation within this family of trying to figure this out, that they finally figure out that there's a problem, and or they figure out that there's a solution, and it's Pittsburgh. They kind of target Pittsburgh as the answer here. They reach out to soldiers and sailors. I think that was a smart move. They saw us, found us, and said, "Hey, can you help us with this?" And at the time, we had this board member. His name was Bill Reynolds, and I mean, Bill was so knowledgeable about the Civil War and specifically burial plots in the Pittsburgh area. And immediately he recognized the uniqueness of EZ. He knew that stood out. He knew that was something that was familiar to him, and he hadn't seen it very many places. So after some quick research in the Allegheny Cemetery archives, Bill Reynolds discovered the mistake. And at that time, they have a new ceremony. They have a proper tombstone, spelled tombstone, placed in Allegheny Cemetery. And the family now finally had that closure of where their loved one was buried from the Civil War. So you can visit Allegheny Cemetery today if you're familiar with the Civil War section there, where there's a lot of tombstones that look like the one we have in the photo here. However, there's one newer looking one, and that is the correctly spelled Easy Hall tombstone. And you see a photo of Easy Hall there next to him. So there's a family back in the Civil War that went through the efforts to try to get their loved one brought home, but you could see a flaw in the system where records were not kept very well. This is before dog tags, so there was no way to identify a lot of these soldiers, even on the battlefield. But even in this case, even though he was identified, the identification was mixed up along the way. So moving on here. Now, I know this was a story that Andrew was going to touch on. Our guest tonight was going to really tell the story of David Burton Foster. He was a man that was a Marine and killed at Belleau Wood in World War I. Belleau Wood, if you're familiar with it, is the major battle for the United States kind of establishing themselves as a functioning and effective military force in World War I. Whereas there was a lot of European nations and armies that did not think the U.S. was going to be very effective. But here at the Belleau Wood, the Marines earned their nickname Devil Dogs and proved themselves on the battlefield. David Foster was killed in Belleau Wood on June 12th, 1918. He was a part of the 43rd Company of the 5th Marines. And he is buried over in France, first in a temporary grave and then a more formal grave over there. But this is not satisfactory to his parents, and his father becomes very outspoken about wanting the remains brought home. I think the United States went into this World War I thinking that most of the dead would be buried over there, as we say, right over in Europe. But that didn't satisfy the Burton family and I think others. But Burton was very outspoken. He met with multiple politicians at every level, all the way up to Washington, D.C., trying to figure out, what needed to be done to get the remains brought home. And unfortunately, he just kept running against roadblock after roadblock. He went as far as to travel to France to see if he could physically get the remains himself, which was halted along the way. But he was persistent enough. He established the Bring Home the Soldier Dead League, which was the topic we were going to talk about tonight, where other families came together, arguing about bringing their loved ones home. And eventually a process was put into place. And it was about 4 years later that finally the remains of David Burton Foster were returned home here to Pittsburgh. He was buried in a cemetery where his family could come and visit. And what we're seeing here is an image of David Burton Foster, and in a frame, and on the right is a metal strip. I think I have a better close-up here. This is the coffin tag. So this was the tag labeled on the coffin that identified who it was, so that we could, make sure that he was not confused, like our last story with Easy Hall. On that tag, it is listed his name, rank, serial number, unit, cemetery site, and grave site number, plot number are all listed on there. So the body is returned with that coffin tag. the coffin tag is removed, and the body is placed in a more appropriate coffin for permanent burial here in the United States. And this kicks off this effort of Bring the Soldier Home Dead League. What we're seeing here are a couple of the certificates that were issued in World War I. These were issued to families for their loved ones and that died. And we see two versions here. We have a version of the United States certificate, and on the left is a version of the French certificate. And these were issued to families whose loved ones were wounded and killed in the war. I'm actually seeing now, very excited that Andrew is back joined with us. And after that faulty mishap in the beginning of having to reestablish, I'm going to bring him in live now and see if I can set this up, add here and do this. Hello, Andrew. How are you doing?
Hey, doing well.
Sorry about the mishap there. For some reason, we did not get a connection on Facebook, so I had to reestablish that. So I'm glad you found us here. I just started telling some of the stories I had planned. I was just talking about David Burton Foster a little bit. So without further ado, let me introduce Andrew here. Andrew is the president of the Trafford Historical Society and co-authored the book Images of America in Trafford, published in 2017 by Arcadia Publishing. He is the author of the book Good War, Great Men, the detailed accounts of Machine Gun Battalion during World War I. In 2018, his book was endorsed as an official project of the World War I Centennial Commission in Washington, D.C. And I know, Andrew, that has a lot of personal connections to you, which you'll be telling us about here shortly. And in the fall of 2021, Andrew's article, Bring Home the Soldier Dead League, was published by the Heinz History Center's Western Pennsylvania History Magazine. And this article is recognized with 2 awards by the Press Club of Western Pennsylvania, one for excellence in written journalism in the history and culture category, and the other with a Best in Show award in Division 7, recognized with the Ray Springle Memorial Award. So this is what kind of brought this to my attention after, Andrew's a loyal viewer of our Spotlight On program. And at the end of last month, I said we didn't know what our topic was. And Andrew brought this topic to my attention. And I was telling everybody earlier, Andrew, that this was kind of new to me. I mean, I was familiar with it, but the detail you brought out really educated me about the whole process. So, Andrew, thank you so much for joining us tonight. And I'm glad to have you with us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me as well, Tim. And you're right. There's this story. There's not a lot of people who do know the details behind it. And so I hope to be able to tell some of that tonight. So we'll start off with the, we'll go with the second slide.
Okay, let me pull that up right now.
Because the story really, for me, it begins at the Soldiers and Sailors right here.
Is this the one? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's it. There's a photo of myself standing to the in the right of the picture is my father, and this photo was taken in April 2002, and we're getting our photograph taken with General George Christmas, who at the time he was the CEO of the Marine Corps Heritage Foundation, and they were showing us plans for what they were building down in Triangle, Virginia, which was the National Museum of the Marine Corps. So we were there for a fundraiser. In fact, you were there as well. We were just chatting about that. And after the presentation of the Marine Corps Museum, we were there with another Marine, my dad and I, Ray Peduzzi, and we were down in your display area. And this, in the center of the picture here, is a picture of a Browning machine gun, the model 1917. And my father walked up to that machine gun and he said, that's the type of machine gun my father fired when he was in France. And while I knew my grandfather was in the First War, I really didn't know his history. And so I think that particular machine gun that you have on display at Soldiers and Sailors really opened the door for me and learning about history of my grandfather, which ultimately led to the book that you see here on the screen. So I'm just grateful for that opportunity that the Soldiers and Sailors gave us, and then this particular machine gun does again open up a story for me. Next slide. So this is a photograph. On the left is my grandfather, who I'm named after. He is probably about 23 years old when he went to war. He served in the 313th Machine Gun Battalion, and that's where I studied to get this story out. But what ties me to this story today is the gentleman that he served with on the right-hand side, Joseph M. Duff Jr., also served with my grandfather in the 313th. The photograph, this was from letterhead. When they first started to train, they were using the Vickers machine gun, so a little bit different than the one they later used the Browning during the war. But it was Duff who opened the door to this story that I learned about. Duff was really a brilliant young man. He went to Princeton, got his degree, and came back to the University of Pittsburgh and worked on his law degree. And while he was at the University of Pittsburgh, he was actually the head football coach for the University of Pittsburgh for 2 years. And his brother had a law office in Pittsburgh. Duff would ultimately go overseas with my grandfather in the 313th, actually as an enlisted. He did not get commissioned at the time, but he would later be recognized by one of the officers in my grandfather's unit who recognized his leadership abilities, and they took Duff out of the 313th and put him with the 125th Infantry Regiment as a machine gunner. To lead a machine gun company. And on October 10th, 1918, Duff was killed. And I'll talk a little bit later about how Duff's family wanted his remains to be returned to Carnegie. But this is, I tell this because it does play into this whole story. And I learned about Duff specifically from a letter that one of the officers of the 313th wrote home to his family, and basically said it was really hitting this gentleman hard. When he wrote home, he said it really hit me hard when Duff was killed. And so it also highlights the fact that there's what potentially these young men who went over, who had so much potential, lost their lives. And I'm very fortunate to be here that my grandfather did survive. Next slide, please. So this is really where the story begins for they bring home the Soldier Dead League. And I'll start on the left with David Burton Foster, which you were just mentioning, 43rd Company, 5th Marines. He was killed in the Battle of Belleau Woods, and most people will recognize that name, the Battle of Belleau Woods, from World War I history. Some historians will consider that almost the birthplace of the modern Marine Corps. So we know that the Marine Corps goes back to 1775, but as far as the reputation of the Marine Corps as being a formidable fighting force, their reputation was elevated in this battle. Unfortunately, it came at quite a cost, which includes the death of Foster. And they called him Bert Foster, was killed on June the 12th, 1918. On the right-hand side are his parents, James and Laura. James was the head of basically his own cleaning supplies company, and he did have his son employed with him at one time. James was also pretty active in civics in McKeesport. He was once the president of the school board. He was secretary of the school board. The couple actually learned about the death of their son on August 23rd, 1918. And that's important because we'll see how long it takes for them to eventually receive their son's remains. But as soon as they did learn about it, if the first instance that they learned was that he was missing in action, and then they learned that he was killed on the 23rd of August, or I'm sorry, that's when they learned. About 38 days later, he contacts the chief of the Graves registration, expressing his desire that after the war is over, he wants to bring his son's remains home, the remains home. So right off the bat, he's already got the intention. And what's important to know is when they went to war, prior to going to war, I should say, the War Department had made a pledge and promised that if your loved one died in battle or died overseas, that they would return the bodies home. So this was already known to the families. Next slide, please. So once the war was over, things in the press start to go a little bit awry for the Fosters. And I say that because there is now public opinion is divided on what to do with the bodies that are of the dead that are in France. And it now becomes debate in the press. Some of these articles, there's multiple articles, but one says, shall the American dead be brought home? There was one particular organization that was trying to seek money. It was called the American Field of Honor Association. And they were seeking about $15 million to build what they called a temple of honor that would surpass any great building of modern times. So they really did intend to want to honor those who have fallen. There's not a lot of clear idea of what the motivations were for some of these groups other than that. But there's also the thought that the families here in the United States thought that they wanted to use them for commercial exploitation, and it would be a tourist attraction. So James Foster and his wife are not real happy with what they're reading about, and there's talk about purchasing the land at Belleau Woods. So Foster travels to Washington, D.C., and he meets with Newton Baker, who is the Secretary of War. And his main goal is to just seek authority from Baker to have his son's remains brought back to McKeesport. We don't know what happened in that conversation, but we know that Baker denied him the authority, and Foster returns back to McKeesport. But what Foster will later read comes out of the press again from Newton Baker. Now, I'll read what he says. Actually, we'll go to the next slide here. Before I get into what Baker said, part of the, two of the people who are prominent figures, well respected, are fueling the debate on keeping the bodies in France. One of them is General John Pershing, General of the Armies. He says that they should lie in France when he's asked. Teddy Roosevelt, he lost his son, Quentin Roosevelt. And Quentin, when he was killed, Teddy Roosevelt wrote to the Army Chief of Staff and said that, quote, "We have always believed that where the tree falls, let it lie there." So these two are suggesting that maybe the bodies remain there. A little bit later, Foster reads a quote from Baker in the newspaper, and I'll just read it. Baker says that he had hoped that a great majority of American parents would let them remain there, but the wishes of the relatives desiring the bodies would be carried out. So Foster's pretty furious at Baker saying this in the press. The other item that really highlights Foster's need to get his son's remains returned is they introduce a bill in Parliament, French Parliament, that says we want to keep these bodies from being disinterred for at least 3 years, starting January 1st, 1919. So Foster does not obviously agree with this. He's writing to Baker, and he sees the quote that Baker says in the newspaper, and he writes to Foster writes to Baker, and again trying to get Baker to give him authority. Baker writes back to him, and this is probably the letter that sets Foster off. And Baker says, "Were a son of mine over there, I believe I should feel as Colonel Roosevelt did, and many other parents for whom word is coming, that the remains of their loved ones should lie beneath the fields where they fought and along the frontier they held. But of course, I would not have the right to urge upon you in a manner of sort any conclusions other than which Mrs. Foster and you have reached." So on one hand, he's saying it's your wishes, but if it were my son, I wouldn't do it. And then he goes on to express what's happening with the graves registration and how they're centralizing the cemeteries, making it a fitting place. But ultimately, in my opinion, that response that Baker gave to the family was what would set off the next, if you can go to the next slide. It sets Baker into action. I'm sorry, it sets Foster in action. And James Foster puts this ad in the newspaper. The parents of the dead soldiers are asked to attend this meeting. The whole idea is to endeavor to start a nationwide movement for the return of the bodies of the American dead. So he's not getting what he wants, Foster, and they organize about 300 people meet at the Allegheny County Courthouse in downtown Pittsburgh. This is just a little bit before the first armistice anniversary. And they come up with, the next day, they come up with the name, Bring Home the Soldier Dead League. And they used that name simply, they said it was fitting for what they, for the purpose for what they were organizing. And their letterhead, I think, was to give some legitimacy while they're communicating with officials. And I was able to at least identify this that you see on the screen, the different states. It started in Pittsburgh, but it expanded to other chapters across the country. They put New York as the national headquarters, and there was a father there that started, he was the president, and they listed James Foster as the secretary of that chapter. And so what started here in Pittsburgh would certainly expand out to other states. And next slide. After they organize, there is a meeting in November 13th, and it's a hearing before the Committee on on Foreign Affairs. They were able to secure this meeting through Stephen Porter, who happened to be from Pittsburgh. At one time, Porter was the solicitor for the city of Allegheny, which today is on the north side of Pittsburgh. And they give approval to two groups to come into this hearing, a group from Richmond and a group from Pittsburgh. And this particular, if you wanted to read the whole transcript, it's I got this off of Google Books, but you can go to the next slide. The first person to speak from the Pittsburgh group is the gentleman on the right. He's Reverend Joseph Duff. He was a First Presbyterian, he was the pastor of the First Presbyterian Church in Carnegie. And he's the father of Joseph Duff, who I mentioned earlier, who was served with my grandfather. This picture that you see is on the far left, the young gentleman with his hands in his pockets. That's the young Joe Duff, probably a young teen there. Behind him with his hand on his shoulder is his brother, George. George was also served. He was a chaplain in the Army. He would be the one that would send the message back home of the fate of their brother. You see his mother and his sister, both named Margaret. And then the gentleman in the back, the other younger gentleman, is Joe Duff's brother. He would later, that's James Duff. He would later become governor of Pennsylvania and also a U.S. senator. So, but it's Reverend Duff who, based on his, I'm sure his ability to give a speech in front of a congregation, he's asked to speak first, and he right away goes to Congress, and he's denouncing the propaganda that has been publicized in the papers. And there's no reason in his mind that these bodies should be staying in France. And he goes on to criticize General Pershing. And he says this: they propose to use our dead after they have given their lives. They are to be used to foster international sentiment. I see no reason in the world that those bodies should not be brought home this winter. So after Duff speaks, the next person to speak is James Foster. And Foster is immediately recognized by the Congress as the head of this new organization, Bring Home the Soldier Dead League. And he goes right off in speaking, saying, look, I'm not representing the 500 or 600 families from Pittsburgh. I'm here representing the 50,000 to 75,000 families from across this nation who want their sons to be brought home. And what he's referring to is this card that is that I have on the screen here, and it's listing Joseph Duff. And what happened in just before this meeting, early on, was they had sent out about 75,000 questionnaires to families who were the emergency contact, and they wanted to know, and this is the Quartermaster Corps, do you desire to have your remains of your son brought back to the United States? And Reverend Duff answered yes. And do you want them to be interred in a national cemetery? He said no. And then what address do you want? So when this survey went out to the families, 69% of the respondents, which was about 43,000, answered that they did want their sons to be returned home. So the purpose of this meeting was less about should you do it or should you not do it. It's already clear that the families want their loved ones to be returned home. The emphasis really for them as an organization was to act on their behalf. This organization wanted the responsibility taken out of the War Department's hands and put into the State Department, and that there would be a civic committee to speed up this process. So start acting on our behalf and disregard what the French want is basically what they were working toward. And it took about, after this meeting with Congress, it took about 4 months for the Senate to appropriate the funds to start this process. Next slide, please. So while the families are waiting for this all to happen, we now go into the spring and summer of 1920. Some of the families traveled to France. They know about this centralized cemeteries. This is a photograph that was taken at the Enmarn American Cemetery. This is an early photograph near Belleau Woods. It's an unidentified couple there. Very likely that they are there to honor their loved one, but it was families traveling there. And Reverend Joseph Duff, he traveled there to Romagna to visit the gravesite of his son, and he also wanted to walk on the battlefield where he learned the history from Joe Duff's commanding officers as to what happened to his son. And I'll mention this. I don't have it on the screen here, but I'll mention there's a book that the Reverend Duff wrote, and the last chapter of his book is titled "It's Hill 258." I'm not going to read that chapter. It's quite honestly, it's very emotional. I read a couple of lines thinking I would add them here, and I'm not going to get choked up reading it. So Tim will have some information on at the end of this. If you wanted to read the whole chapter, it's a beautiful tribute to his son that it's well worth a read. The photo you see here in the gentleman is J.D. Foster. He's about 45 in this photo. It was when he was a school board member. And he traveled to France at age 55 to not only visit his son's grave. Foster has every intention of securing his son's remains and bringing them back to McKeesport. So when Foster arrives in France, he's actually carrying with him a metal casket. And he's making arrangements over the next several months with officials, government officials, French officials, that he's going to disinter his son's remains. It's unclear exactly what he did, but there was a memo that was sent back to Washington, D.C., the Graves Registration headquarters, and it's coming from the chief of the Graves Registration in France, Lieutenant Colonel Harry Rethers, and this is in June of 1920. And he tells headquarters that he had given orders to place a civilian guard at night in the cemetery with instructions that the caretaker call municipal authorities to arrest any visiting American who attempts to remove the bodies. So, and then he goes on to say that Mr. Foster seems bent on trespassing on our cemetery grounds without permission. So I don't know exactly what Foster was doing. He did say in some of the letters he was going to be respectful of the other soldiers that were buried there, other Marines, but he's still trying to secure the authority, and no one's giving him the okay to remove the body. And in fact, even to say that he's trespassing, he must have been working angles to get his son disinterred. So he's getting pushed back. Let's go to number 11. That's good. So he's getting pushed back from the people in France. He writes again to Secretary Baker, and he tells Baker that I will personally disinter my son's body regardless of the consequences. And Baker is able to somehow calm him down. He knows he's not going to be able to do it on his own, and asks him, look, if I let you do it, everyone else is going to want to do the same thing. And Foster eventually gives in and does not take his son's remains. What they do allow him to do is leave that metal casket in France for transport back to McKeesport. And I didn't include this story in the article that was in the magazine because it can get very detailed and pretty lengthy. But it's also very fascinating what happens next. This is a photo of the Enmarn cemetery on the left, where they're removing a casket that has been buried once. Well, when they take Foster out of the ground where his cross is, and they open the casket, it's not Foster inside the casket. It's someone else. And I'm learning this by the correspondence in the file. They disinter another body. It's not Foster. So from what I can tell, it's at least 3 graves that had to be taken up. The crosses above them were not planted where those above the, I'm sorry, they didn't match up with the grave. But fortunately, Burton Foster did have his ID tag on him, so they were able to identify him, took some personal belongings out of the casket. They put his remains in the casket that Foster brought, and then they buried him for the 3rd time. And his 4th burial will be back in Trevosburg. On the right-hand side of the screen, this is the time period when they are disinterring the remains for those who do want their family members do want them to be brought back to the United States. And this is the Enmarn Cemetery, American Cemetery near Belleau Woods. All right, next slide, please. So in July of 1921, thousands of soldiers start returning back to the United States, and they're heading into Hoboken, New Jersey. There was one particular soldier that was given special attention, and that was Thomas Francis Enright. He was one of the first 3 Americans killed in the war. He was killed on November 3rd, 1917. But when I say he was given special treatment, at Hoboken, General Pershing met the ship when it came in. When they unloaded the caskets, they had a ceremony in Hoboken, and General Pershing laid a wreath on Enright's casket along with the other first 3 Americans. Enright was brought back to Pittsburgh, and he is in the Soldiers and Sailors in this photograph. He's in Soldiers and Sailors Memorial Hall, and he lays in state. I received this photograph from Scott Irwin, who was a relative to Enright, and It was on July 15th, 2021 when he was in Memorial Hall. Next slide, please. The next photograph, pretty moving, it appeared in the paper. Again, I got this photograph from Scott. They're proceeding from the into St. Mary's, I should say, St. Mary's Cemetery in Lawrenceville, and the gentlemen that are carrying the casket they all served during the First World War. They're all classmates of Enright, and you can see a family member coming in behind. I believe that's one of Scott Irwin's ancestors. On the right-hand side is a photograph. This photo has been seen by very few, and I say that because Scott Irwin, who's been studying Enright, he never saw this photograph when I shared it with him. It's located at the Heinz History, the Dieter Library. It was in a scrapbook, and at this photo itself, it says Enright's grave taken by Philip, and at the Catholic Cemetery on Penn Avenue. Philip was Philip Showalter Hench, was his name. He was would later on become a Nobel Prize winner in medicine, but it was his mother who kept the scrapbook of during the war. Next slide, please. So finally, it's time for Bert Foster, to be returned home. And James Foster learns that the ship is coming into Hoboken, and he sends this telegram from McKeesport to the Graves Registration, and he basically says to them, hold the body. I want to personally accompany the body home. So he arrives at Hoboken, and again, another obstacle in his way as the ship is sitting in the pier and they're unloading the bodies, they have about 1,500 bodies on the pier. It catches on fire, and they have to drag the ship out into the river as the pier's on fire, and hundreds of volunteers are picking the bodies that are on the pier, and they get them to safety. And ultimately, there were about 1,500 flag draped coffins that are transported home, and the rest of them are removed off the ship. Next slide. Finally, the Fosters are able to bury their son. Mr. Foster gives this beautiful headstone with the Eagle, Globe, and Anchor on it. It says Semper Fidelis, David Burton Foster. There is a poem that he includes it's kind of hard to see on the screen, but it's a line from In Flanders Fields, and I think it's fitting. It says, "To you from falling hands I throw the torch of liberty, be yours to hold it high." I kind of feel that that's a message to all of us who are interested in these topics to remember these men. On the right-hand side is the headstone for Joseph Duff. To kind of come full circle, and I was able to meet with one of the Duff, the great nephew to Joe Duff, at his gravesite in 2020. And while we were there, when I say come full circle, if you can go to the next screen, Tim. When Joe Duff was brought home, he was accompanied by Vernon Richardson, who was in charge of returning these 5 names back to the families in Carnegie. One of the names on there is John Mannion. Mannion's also in the 313th Machine Gun Battalion, so he would have gone over to France with Joe Duff and gone over with my grandfather. So John and I said to John, let's go see if we can't find his cemetery and headstone itself, because it wasn't too far. The next slide, please. So on the left-hand side, this was John Mannion's headstone, quite deteriorated and worn. It was leaning over. And in 2023, just this year, with the help of a good friend of mine, Bill Bray, who I know is watching tonight, Bill has been a phenomenal resource to a lot of families, and he was able to secure a new headstone for John Mannion. And I just think it's fitting that we have this here. And I should mention right now, this is the 100th anniversary of the American Battle Monuments Commission. They do a phenomenal job in obviously maintaining the headstones, and that's why I pointed out that that one quote. I think it's really up to us who are still here, and we know of someone who has given their life, that we can do something like this to honor the life of John Mannion. And then with the final slide. This is just where you can find, if you're interested in reading the article itself, it's still available through the Heinz History Center. That's my website address if you wanted to read that chapter on Hill 258. And then my other website that I run, Trafford History, where you can contact me. But Tim, I hope I didn't take up too much time there.
No, that was wonderful, Andrew. A lot of great information. In fact, seeing some nice comments here. William Bray, Bill, as you said, Bill Bray has joined us, as well as a few others. In fact, Michael Krause, our curator, is joining us from Melbourne, Australia. He's at the airport, and even Michael is learning a lot of new details. So anytime you can, teach Michael a few things, that you've hit on some good information that not a lot of people know about. So fascinating information. And I started with the beginning here because some of the technical difficulties started telling us some of the stories that we have related. I'm going to pick up here with this. This was some of the personal belongings you mentioned, that might have been removed from that coffin, when they reinterred Burton Foster. This mess kit was on him when he was killed and was buried with him. And I'm assuming kind of removed at that time, but still came home with the remains. And this set, along with his portrait, hung in post 361, American Legion post 361, hung in his honor. And it was there for 80 years, I believe, as a tribute to him. And then as that post started to wind down, those items did come to Soldiers and Sailors, which introduced us to that story, and then kind of tied everything together with Andrew's research here. So that's on display at our museum, his mess kit, and of course the portrait we saw earlier. Also, Thomas Enright, of course, is a big part of our story here in World War I, being that he's from Pittsburgh, one of the first 3 killed. There's a little bit of an up-close photo of him there. And we have this photo that we use a lot because here you can see the outside of our building. Up there in the top right corner is Soldiers and Sailors. And this is a procession with the coffin for Thomas Enright right down the front stairs. I believe he's on his way to St. Paul's, because we also have a photo of him in front of St. Paul's.
You're right.
For a ceremony there before he is, permanently interred at St. Mary's Cemetery, as you mentioned. And I found this quick shot of the tombstone, which is present day, that you can go and find in St. Mary's Cemetery there, which is directly adjacent to the Allegheny Cemetery. Mm-hmm. And then just a couple quick stories here I wanted to touch on, because I do think it's important just to kind of tie it into a little bit more modern times, even though what we're looking at here is Korea. But the important story, part of this story, is the active efforts to find remains of our soldiers all around the globe and return them home. It's the duty of the Department of Defense. The POW and the MIA accounting agency is very active every single day, trying to find remains. And of course, with new technologies, especially like DNA testing and matching and things like that, that make this much more feasible and much more possible. This is the story of Daniel Kelly, who was the youngest of 9 brothers. And one of those brothers was Charles Kelly, who was the Medal of Honor recipient from World War II, known as Commando Kelly. And Daniel looked up to his brother and wanted to be a soldier, and Korea came along, and that was his opportunity. But he was only 17 years old. So he actually got his brother to sign for him, and that allowed him to join and head over to Korea. And it was really within his first month in Korea, he is captured. He is a POW, initially reported as an MIA, but later, recognized as a POW of the war. But that's where it ends. Nobody knows. At that time, nobody knew what happened to them. And that story goes dormant until 2002, where there is a joint venture between Korea and the American recovery teams, and they discover an old North Korea POW camp, and the remains are exhumed and brought back to Hawaii, where the Department of Defense has their headquarters, and they were able to match DNA to the Kelly family, and now just a couple of years ago, those remains were finally brought back to Pittsburgh. There's a lot to this process. It took a good 15 years or so between even when they brought the remains to Hawaii, the identification process, everything takes time. But eventually, just a couple of years ago, the remains were returned, buried in the cemetery of the Alleghenies, and the family was very generous to donate the coffin flag, as you see there folded. You see his photo there, and then his medals up above there. So just a nod to the efforts that are ongoing at all times. In fact, I just grabbed a couple quick stats. Just in 2023 alone, 127 service members have been identified. Remains have been identified from around the globe. 88 of those from World War II, 35 from Korea, and 4 from Vietnam. So just this past year, well over 100 remains have been identified for these efforts. So this idea of bringing the dead home is still a part of the mindset of the American military and the Department of Defense. And then the last story I had here was the story of Gary Radford, who was a sergeant in the 101st Airborne, and he actually received the Silver Star in Vietnam. He is a member of our Hall of Valor. And in 1970, in the Shaw Valley at Firebase Ripcord, he is basically in a huge firefight. A couple of his members from his company crawl off or go missing, and he never knows what happens to him. So here we are in this missing in action situation where it kind of haunts Gary for years to come after the war. He never knows, never gets any closure what happened to these guys. In 1996, Gary is asked to return to Vietnam, which he does, and locates this position where he last saw these guys. And this is what was found in the jungle there, this rusted out helmet and rusted out M60 machine gun. The helmet does clearly have a bullet hole through there. That I think we're seeing probably the exit hole there in the back. And the machine gun, the serial number was matched to Gary Radford's company. So there's a direct link that kind of all dots are getting connected here, that these guys did not survive. And no remains were found on this trip, but Gary Radford was, at least found some closure by finding these items and, kind of getting to the point of, okay, these guys didn't make it. They weren't prisoners. That nothing, they didn't suffer. They died there in a part of this firefight here at Firebase Ripcord. So these items are on display in our POW MIA case, and they can come and visit those and see those anytime that you visit Soldiers and Sailors here. I do have one thing here from Michael. Would you comment on how British Commonwealth soldiers lie in cemeteries in the country they fell? Is that something you can comment on, Andrew?
I don't know a lot of detail other than, when I visited in France, there are a number of cemeteries, British cemeteries, and I know Mike's in New Zealand. I specifically went to the New Zealand cemeteries because the 313th, when their first baptism of fire, they were training with the New Zealanders, and so I wanted to find specifically their cemeteries, but to my knowledge, it was just a custom maybe where they fell, they would simply bury them. They did similar centralized cemeteries, but I don't believe that they had plans to return them back to their home countries, because there are a number of cemeteries along the Western Front from the British Commonwealth graves, but I can't speak much more than that.
Okay. I'm also seeing a comment here from Bill Bray. He's asking me to contact him. So maybe, Andrew, you could help me out and put me in touch with Bill.
Yeah.
Send me his contact information. And Bill, I'll definitely be reaching out in the next, before the holiday here, and we can connect that way. So I look forward to talking with you. Bringing our slideshow back up here, Soldiers and Sailors. As always, you can learn more about us on our website, soldiersandsailorshall.org. You can visit. We are open Mondays through Saturdays, 10 to 4, but I certainly suggest you visit our website just to make sure that They're not closed for anything special, especially over the holidays now. There's some closures. Sometimes we have private events that we have to close for. So our regular hours are Monday through Saturday, 10 to 4, but I do recommend checking the website before you visit. You can also schedule guided tours by appointment by contacting me, and we can set up different types of guided tours that we have available. This Saturday is our next Tabletop Gamers. I talk about this every month. It's a monthly program here where people come to play tabletop games at Soldiers and Sailors, military themed games. And this December, we'll be playing games related to the Battle of the Bulge and the Korean War, kind of a winter theme there for the games that will be played on Saturday. And that is just all day long. Our regular hours, 10 to 4. All it is regular museum admission, and you can come and see the museum, but also play some tabletop military games. And I just want to say to everybody, happy holidays. It is coming up on the holiday season, and I just want to say happy holidays to everybody. I hope everybody has a safe and healthy holiday. And with that, I'm going to say our next program, which will be on January 11th, 2024. I'm already behind I put 223. 2024 will be 1 year in the curatorial department. This has become kind of an annual tradition for us where we look back on the past year of some of the new artifacts that we got donated to us and highlight those for people to see. It's one of the exciting things about working at Soldiers and Sailors. New stuff is coming in all the time. And it's great that we have the opportunity to share some of those stories as a part of this annual January Spotlight On program. So with that, I want to thank you, Andrew, so much for sharing all your knowledge with us this evening and for bringing this to my attention, because I did not know much about this. And as I said from the last program, I wasn't sure what I was going to do this month. And you came through and introduced me to this and then gave us a great presentation. So thank you so much, Andrew.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
And with that, I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. I see Arletta also joined us. Very informative. Thank you, Arletta. Good to see you. I know she's a regular listener. Nick Otto, George, all those folks. I'm so glad you were able to spend some time this evening. And I want to say thank you all and good night. And I'll see you in the new year.